After enjoying a successful music career in his native Iceland, composer Atli Örvarsson moved to the United States and studied music composition at Berkeley, soon landing a scoring position on the hit TV series NYPD Blue with composer Mike Post. Orvarsson eventually joined Hans Zimmer's remote control studios, learning the ropes of composing for a wide variety of genres until he eventually landed several auspicious solo ventures, where he delivered a heavy percussive design for Vantage Point and epic orchestral sounds for Babylon A.D. The Eagle is perhaps his strongest work in terms of scope and experimentation with natural sounds and folk instruments, and in his latest work, Hansel and Gretel Witch Hunters, Orvarsson creates a kinetic melange of orchestral, folk, and rock styles to match the transposition of the classic Brothers Grimm fairy tale from wandering kids to a pair of adult bounty hunters. Our discussion begins with Hansel and Gretel.
I noticed that you've done a number of scores that are set in specific periods, and I wonder if you do any kind of unique research before starting the projects.
Yeah, definitely. To be honest, not so much with this one, since it's kind of a period that I know a little bit better than some of the other ones. Probably the one I did the most sort of unique research was for the Eagle. The year 140 A.D. is sort of a... Well, there isn't much known about what music sounded like then, really. But in that case, I went to Scotland and recorded a bunch of musicians and sounds and ideas, with really, really primitive instruments. Some of them as primitive as rocks from the beach, and others a bit more involved, such as this ancient Celtic horn called the carnix, which has been found in several sort of excavations on the British Isles and in Normandy and other places. And this musicologist I work with in Scotland got a grant from the government there to have one built, just sort of based on the remnants that they had found, and so we used that in the score. But for that particular one, there was a lot of research. But for Hansel and Gretel, like I said, it supposedly takes place in the 1700s in Germany, and musically that's a period that I'm somewhat familiar with, just obviously from school. And I mean, it's the beginning of the classical period in a way, and this particular version of Hansel and Gretel is very much geared towards a modern day audience, obviously, and kind of a new, fresh, almost a rock and roll take on it, if you will. So, it was more about merging that period with the sound of today.
I like the way that you balance the two. I think there's also a really interesting use of electric guitar in this score.
As always, the job is to bring the vision of the filmmakers to fruition in a way. And Tommy Wirkola, the director, he actually used to play drums in rock and roll bands in Norway. And the first word that he mentioned to me in regards to music was Metallica. And I sort of thought to myself, okay, Hansel and Gretel in Germany in the 1700s and Metallica. How do we bridge that gap? And little by little, it kind of somehow merged into one thing, And I jokingly call it Baroque and roll, but there isn't often you hear harpsichord and electric guitars next to each other. So I think it was kind of a fun experiment, really.
The balance, I think, is what struck me as being so effective, because one score that comes to mind where they used an orchestral background and attempt to give it a rock sound, but deliberately to aim it towards a younger audience, was Call the Conqueror. And it's a really interesting score because there's a huge robustness in the orchestra, but the way that the electric guitar is used, I think it's a bit too overt, and it interrupts kind of the elegance of the orchestra. But I think what you did was much more effective because it's a bit more sly, a bit more witty, and it's not predominant.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I actually almost thought of the guitars as an extension of the low brass, like as the sort of the evil twin of the trombone section or something, So I'm glad you picked up on that, because that was really something that I really thought about a lot. I feel like it is quite tricky to put the guitar into the setting without it becoming cheesy, in my opinion. So, I really thought about it a lot, and, I mostly use it for power chords and like I said, to support the orchestra rather than be sort of stand out,
I think one of the things that you're known for, and it's something that's always impressed me, is your use of percussion, and specifically percussion textures. And I wonder if you can describe your approach when it comes to selecting and crafting rhythmic cues. Are there specific percussion pieces that you enjoy using, or do you find that the subject matter itself is what kind of dictates it? And then, secondly, how do you sort of build those elaborate pieces? Because there's one in Hansel and Gretel that's particularly impressive.
Another interesting sort of twist that came up, while I was working on the score was dubstep has has become sort of a catchphrase in film music as of late, and in a way, it's sort of a shorthand for just saying, let's make this kind of modern sounding. And percussion, whether we like it or not, is more and more moving towards being electronically generated. I mean, it just so happens that when it comes to sampling and programming, drums are kind of the thing that sounds the best. So I think, in a way, getting back to the dubstep idea, at some point that word came up in the discussion, and so we started with Metallica and then gone down a more orchestral road, and when that word was thrown in, that sort of opened up a new kind of a, how do I say this, sort of like another dimension to where it was headed with the score. So I think, for me, what's interesting about it is the art of blending big sort of orchestral sounding percussion or even taiko drums and that kind of a thing with very sort of electronic sounding percussion bits. And I brought in one of the greatest drummers in the world, Matt Chamberlain, to play some parts too on the score. So in a way, I feel like, you could think of the percussion in the score as kind of three percussion sections, if you will, or three flavors. There's the big orchestral stuff, there's more of a drum kit kind of a thing, and then the electronic aspect of it. I don't know if I necessarily have any sort of a conceptual plan when it comes to blending them. It's more just kind of a taste thing, but obviously all our electronic stuff was handmade, and none of it is libraries or anything like that. So it was all quite deliberate. I also ended up doing quite a big percussion session for percussion players at Sony, playing anything from cymbals to taikos to the Mahler hammer. So a lot of thought was put into the production of the percussion, and this score is such a hybrid that I'm grabbing influences from all over the place. At the end of the day, it's just a lot of work to get it all to sit together.
I'm just curious if you knew early on that you wanted to be a film composer, because I guess it's sort of unusual to take the long journey going from one country to another country, and particularly when you come to the United States because of the heavy amount of competition that there is.
Well, I mean, it was quite early on, to be honest. When I actually moved to Boston to go to Berkley, I'd reached a place in Iceland, I was playing in bands and stuff like that, and I'd reached a place where I felt that there wasn't much growth to be had, within Iceland. I'd already gotten platinum records and stuff like that, and I was 22 years old, so I figured, let's try something else. And at the time, I was playing, a lot of piano, playing jazz. But to be honest, I didn't really know what I wanted to study, so I just went there and tried a bunch of things. And, I'd always loved film, and I'd always loved music. And, there was a few scores along the way, like Star Wars when I was a kid, Cinema Paradiso from Ennio Morricone, The Mission from Ennio Morricone, some other sort of milestones growing up, hearing film music that really spoke to me. But it wasn't until I went to Berkeley and I tried it. They have a film music program, so I just thought I'd take a course and see what it was like, and I just instantly fell in love with doing film music. So, I certainly didn't go to Berkeley to study that, but just it rather sort of fell into my lap, and I just had a eureka moment. I just knew this is what I wanted to do, and I was probably 22 at the time, and so I figured I'm really lucky to know what I want to do with my life, and and B, it's probably good to figure that out at that early of a point in your life. And then it just sort of, one thing led to another. I there wasn't a grand plan really. It was just sort of, wait, this is kind of cool. Let me explore this a bit more. And then I did a master's degree in film music composition. And from there on, the only logical place to go really was Hollywood, since I'd come this far. And
Is NYPD Blue your first credit?
a good question.
I'm just curious what it was like to work with Mike Post, because I think probably among the two veterans that you've worked with, I would imagine that Mike Post and Hans Zimmer are probably the two most important people. One, because I guess the first one gave you your start, and the second one because he sort of embraced you in this very sophisticated apprenticeship program, because a lot of the composers that I've worked with Zimmer have learned so many different aspects of both the creative part as well as the business part. But I imagine that even on an earlier project like NYPD Blue, there must have been some very key pieces of learning.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, I've been incredibly blessed with studying, or sort of, being around these two giants of their sort of specific disciplines. I mean, Mike Post is without a doubt the biggest TV composer of all times. I mean, in terms of volume and accolades and all that stuff. And probably the thing that I learned from him more than anything else was, how do I say this? The dominant sort of aspect of working in television with him was the sheer, amount of music that we did. I at the time we were doing usually about 5 TV series per season. Each one is about 22 episodes, so that's 110 episodes of television, maybe in 8 months. That's a lot of music, and it was just me and him doing it all. So it does a few things. A, you have no time to really question your inspiration or your ideas. It just has to go out, and that's actually a really liberating thing, where you just sort of, when you're starting out, I think it took me about 3 weeks to write my first 1.5-minute cue when I was at Berkley, and all of a sudden you're faced with, you got to produce, I don't know, I haven't really added up, but let's say an hour's worth of music per week. The other aspect of it obviously is, doing that much work with picture, you really learn to just to take a scene apart and analyze it and figure out what it needs dramatically. So it was an amazing education in filmmaking, really. And then, working with Hans, it's sort of the polar opposite, because working with him on a film, there's usually kind of a team working on it, and one of the reasons why Hans likes to do it that way is the simple fact that the more time you have to work on a cue, the better it's going to get. So with him, oftentimes I'd have maybe a week to do, say, 5 minutes of music. So the attention to detail and the, just making sure that everything is fully thought out and through composed, it is almost the polar opposite of what we're doing at Mike. So I've been lucky to see, the breadth of that sort of scope of different aspects of scoring and different approaches.
And then just my last question is about, is there a particular film type or genre that you've never scored but would like to? Because you've done some fairly large-scale and small-scale scores, whether it's in the horror or action genre. But is there something that you still yet to tackle that you'd like to try?
Yeah, I mean, I think that what intrigues me most right now maybe is sort of more kind of personal stories and maybe more sort of human dramas than what I've been doing. I've done a lot of action and thrillers and horror even, and so I'd say it would be, more human dramas, that kind of a thing. And, with 2 little kids, I'd love to do more animation.
Atli Örvarsson's Hansel and Gretel, Witch Hunters is available as a digital album from major online retailers. For related film and film music reviews, please visit KQEK.com. This program is copyright 2013 by Mark R. Hassan.